Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. You're watching The Naturalist Capitalist, and I've got a guest on the show today. I've got Charles with the Lone Wolf Podcast. How you doing, Charles?
Doing great, Reed. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Thanks for coming on, man.
Pleasure's mine.
So you were first called the Independent Report when you started your podcast, and through our messaging, you've kind of told me that you're really an independent-minded person. You come down on the right on some things, on the left on other things. So without going on for too long, you want to kind of summarize what issues are important to you and what you think of the political landscape nowadays.
Oh, wow. Just starting with the ones that are the most important to me. I'm a guy from, blue collar South Carolina, small town, Spartanburg. Was born in Pickens County, which is even smaller area of South Carolina. My entire family blue collar, about as blue collar as you can get. Now I kind of had a divided, different political sides in the family. My dad's side's more conservative. He's still to this day Donald Trump supporter. My mother-in-law is more conservative, but from my mom's side of the family, those were blue collar Democrats to the bone. My grandpa on that side of the family is one of the big, blue dog FDR, guys coming up right after the Great Depression. FDR was the idolized hero for a lot of blue collar Democrats. So, that's kind of where my political background come from. And the biggest thing that has impacted this area of the country is more or less the economy and jobs. Now, obviously, I've taken an interest into, our involvement around the world, the wars, the nonstop war, because in a lot of ways, in my opinion, it kind of ties to the economy and the jobs. Because while we got rid of our jobs and outsourced, we replaced a lot of that with a war machine to try to bring things into our country. So we want to go wage war to try to get our hands on, mineral rights or resources or whatever. And so we've kind of turned that into our revenue system, really, as backwards as that sounds, more than actually doing things inside the country the way we did, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Right. Yeah. So what do you think of the Democrat and Republican parties when it comes to the solutions for those things? Do you think they're just both wrong? They need to come together and work together? Or what's your general opinion on the divide and the ridiculousness and the partisanship?
But when it comes to the Democrat and the Republican Party, I don't know that either one of them have the solution. Do I think they know the solution? Sure. Are they going to try to put it into play? Absolutely not. Here's the thing about the Democrats and the Republicans. As divided as they seem to all of us, if you watch closely, they're really not that divided. They can find unity with each other when it comes time to shaft the middle class and help out, the Wall Street or things of that nature. They always find a way to help out the people who pay to get them reelected, and that comes at the expense of everyone else. So, in my opinion, it's time for the Democrats and the Republicans to go. And for those out there who are still thinking there's a solution there, I think the left is going through a stage right now with some Bernie Sanders, Andrew Yang, and Tulsi Gabbard type characters, kind of like some right-wingers did with Donald Trump. Donald Trump hit the campaign trail. He talked about a lot of populist issues, but the minute he took office, he didn't hold true to any of them. And then you had the three real outsiders. I'm not going to count Elizabeth Warren in there, and Marianne Williamson never really took off in the first place. But with Yang, Gabbard, and Sanders, they all kind of ran against the system. We want to institute these policies. We're going to be for the people. They ran on that. And honestly, out of the three, I would still say Tulsi is the most genuine. But they've all now coalesced behind the one guy who did not run with any of their policies. He's probably not going to even attempt to put it in place. And the only thing he would do with him is potentially offer him a cabinet position just so he thinks he can win your vote over without actually giving you any of the policy you wanted. So it's almost kind of like with Trump. He said one thing, he did another. They ran on this. Now they're sheep herding you, or trying to the Joe Biden campaign. So I think the writing's on the wall. It's time to get rid of Democrats and Republicans because this just isn't working.
Right. I think what it is you said that they're really very similar parties. They just are on a surface level different. I think that's true.
Yeah.
And I think, the three people you mentioned kind of resemble what the Democrat Party likes to think it stands for. And then you have some people in the Republican Party, a few of them, I'd say like Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Thomas Massey, people that stand for the things that the Republican Party likes to think that it stands for, but they're really both for the corporate overlords and the war machine, and just like everything you said, just for their donors. I mean, you've got a blue donor and a red donor, you get the same problem basically.
Yeah.
So one of the first, or I guess it was the first video I saw you in, was with Dave Spria, who recommended I check you out. And anyone watching this video, go check out Dave. I had him on the show.
Yeah.
You guys were talking about the Green Party and the Libertarian Party. So why don't you just tell us what you think about those two parties? Are they a joke, or do they have good solutions, or what do you think?
Between the two, I'll start with this. In my opinion, the Libertarian Party has at least taken this seriously. The Green Party, while I agree with certain things, and I don't agree with everything that they advocate for either, some of their things get a little too far left for my taste. But I don't think they take themselves seriously. I mean, they still really haven't gotten the ballot access in all 50 states. You had, a massive internal squabble this time around that was almost, like something we expected to see from a Trump-Clinton debate. You even had Green Party candidates going after, and you mentioned David, okay? David brought a particular, I won't even give him the credibility of mentioning his name, but he brought him on his program, let him, get his message out there, only to turn around later because Dave wasn't singing his praises. He tried to, promote Howie Hawkins a little bit, and then he tried to bury Dave on Twitter and, accuse him of this and that, tell him he should delete his Twitter. That sounds like something you expect to see on Donald Trump's Twitter account, right? You're supposed to be an alternative here. Also, I believe it was the Rhode Island Green Party that has basically said they're not even going to allow their nominee, Howie Hawkins, to be on the ballot because they want to help Joe Biden. So if you're here to prop up the Democrats, why are you even, participating? You're just wasting everyone's time if you're telling us you'd rather have Joe Biden than your own nominee anyway. So I think the Green Party is playing that they're running for president. I think they're acting it out. I don't think they take this thing seriously at all. Whereas at least in the Libertarian, a lot of what I've studied on Libertarian is kind of a throwback to old school Republican in a lot of ways. And, a lot of Libertarians have said, hey, the Republican Party's lost their way. We're trying to, stand on a lot of what the old Republican Party used to stand for. When we get into the Libertarian Party, obviously I have some disagreements there as well. And I'm sure we'll end up talking about those. But as far as what I like about the Libertarian Party, I'm a big civil liberties guy. I don't like people telling me what I can and cannot do. And that's kind of been an issue of mine lately with some factions over on the left. A lot of folks seem to be taking the mindset of we're going to get what we want regardless of what anyone else wants or thinks, whether that be through gun control, whether that be through getting rid of the police entirely, just throwing them out and having, these made up new versions of police. And if you read certain articles, I've even pitched the idea of this consisting of former violent criminals. This isn't something I can get on board with. And so I'm a big civil liberties guy. I believe we should all have individual freedom. And I don't believe in one group having ultimate power to control anyone else. So when we get into things like that, I can really relate to the Libertarian Party. Some of the economic stuff, and I say some, not all, but some is where I kind of, get a little questionable there as well. But between the two, and because of what we've got with Biden and Trump, I've already made my mind up. Green Party doesn't take themselves seriously, so I'll be voting for Jo Jorgensen in November.
All right, sweet. Well, I like to hear that. The reason I started this channel is because I think the Libertarians are extremely bad at messaging. I mean, out of everything they suck at, that is the worst. And they come off as arrogant, idealistic, I'd say stupid sometimes. I think Jo Jorgensen is actually a pretty good candidate compared to some we could have ended up with. But that's really what my mission is to meet people on their own turf and try to explain libertarianism in a different light, because I can talk in a libertarian circle and I can be as blunt as I want and they're going to understand where I'm coming from. I'm not going to turn anyone away. What they forget is, none of us started as libertarians. I was a Republican before, and I kind of swung over to the left for a little while and then realized that wasn't for me either. And I was brought in by the things I had in common with them. So that's what I really try to, that's where I try to put my first foot out with someone else is, okay, we can agree on this. Now let me explain this issue that you have trouble with. So you kind of have laid out already what you agree with on civil liberties, war, individualism. So why don't you tell us about the things with the Libertarian Party that you're skeptical of, and then maybe we can dive into some of those issues. Maybe I can explain them in a light that libertarians are not very good at.
The biggest concerns that I would say that I have is not so much on the philosophy. It's about actually getting it put into place and working the way that it should. So, for example, the more right-wing philosophy, and this comes from, from what I gather, libertarian as well, is that, let the free market have the power to do what it needs to do. And I agree. Sometimes too much bureaucracy, too much paperwork can really slow down creativity. It can slow down business. I completely agree with that. The only problem that I've got is with the way the current system has evolved over the years, thanks to corruption, we haven't seen capitalism put to use the way that it should be. In a lot of cases, greed can corrupt people over time. And when you don't have certain checks to watch out for that kind of greed, it's easy for capitalism, if it's not watched, to turn, from what I've seen, into the crony capitalism. Kind of the evidence of that was, before we started negotiating a lot of free trade deals, and there was a little bit more of, okay, we're not going to make it so that if you outsource your job to Mexico, I won't say China, because back in those days when this was really practiced, we hadn't opened trading relations with China at the time. But it wasn't financially that, beneficial for you to go to Mexico, make your product and send it back into the country because you could sell it, cheaper, make it cheaper, and make yourself more profit. There were things there put in place. Well, over time, those barriers were taken away. And so what we found is that now that there's no safeguards there, when you let corporations have too much control over what's taking place, it's kind of like the old trickle down economics. They're not letting that flow back down the ladder. They're saying, okay, more for me, more for me, more for me, less for everyone else. So if you fix the system, I'm a firm believer that capitalism can work, but I believe there's more pieces to the puzzle as well. You've got to put the puzzle back together so that you have that entire picture where capitalism can work. And that takes, in my opinion, even though I don't like a lot of government involvement, I do think the government has a role to do what's right for the people and try to restore those boundaries. If you can get that accomplished, I feel like you could see capitalism start to work much better. But I feel like as a product over time, right now, under the current system, you see too much crony capitalism. And you've got to kind of rebuild what we had at one point in time in history that the elites figured out a way to gyp the middle class out of.
Right. So I actually used to think that exact same way that you just described. until, from the research I've done and the people I've listened to, things I've seen, crony capitalism exists because of the government. And I'd heard that argument before, and I was like, no, come on. But then you start digging into it, and it's kind of interesting. A lot of these regulations that are put in place that are supposedly supposed to help the people, they end up being abused by the powerful corporations, and then the people can't do anything about them. And then a lot of these regulations that are put in place, they are sold to us as though they're there to help us when the original intent of them wasn't even good. So the minimum wage is a great example of that, and I used to support the minimum wage. But the minimum wage was first instituted to keep Black people and Asian people from being able to get jobs because they would obviously be paid less back then. And so it was basically a union ploy to keep white people employed and crush people who were of lower, higher ability from getting a job. So nowadays, it's not as much of an issue with race, but if you have a low skill level, and especially if you're a young person who hasn't worked before, if the minimum wage is really high, you're not going to be able to get a job as easily.
Right.
So that's just one example, but there are a lot of these regulations that end up hurting the consumer or the worker and benefiting the producer. Another one is government-backed loans. So I'll use college as an example. I think it was back in the 60s we started giving student loans because, students had to work through summer to pay off college. And we had this great idea. A bank can loan money to these kids during their school years so that they can take the summer off and then they can just pay back over time. Which, because working through summer and paying off school sounds so terrible nowadays, right? Imagine if we could do that. But then the government got involved and they started backing these student loans from the banks. And so then what the colleges started doing was upping their tuitions, and they just jack them as high as they want because the government would guarantee the loan. And then I think about 10 years ago, we said, okay, we need to get the middlemen out of this. And you hear that as an argument with healthcare today. Like, we got to get the middlemen out, everything will be fine. So we did that, and now the government directly supplies student loans, and now college prices are twice as high as they were 10 years ago.
Yes.
And so all these, this is crony capitalism when the government and big business have an alliance against the consumer or against the customer. Right. So I agree with you that we need to fix the system, but I've actually found that it's really by removing a lot of regulations that are in place that are abused by the powerful. And I fear just adding more regulations is going to make the problem even worse. You know where I'm coming from?
Well, I see what you're saying, and I agree with it to an extent there, because I agree the current regulations that we have and that we see a lot of today are not helping the situation at all. So like I said, for example, earlier, when it comes to like building infrastructure, we've gotten so much paperwork in the way, it becomes hard to get things like that through. So that doesn't obviously help the thing done. You obviously you want a safe structure, but when does it become too much? So you've got things like that for sure. But a lot of the regulation that we see today are things that were put in place after the jobs started to go away. You know what I mean? After a lot of the, in my opinion, a lot of the rich, the Wall Street, they started getting more involved, giving more money, after we potentially saw things like Citizens United, where it said that, corporations' freedom of speech is their money, so they're allowed to donate into political campaigns. And you started to see a lot of these things put in place where it's, creating the conditions so that they can outsource and not really pay any kind of a repercussion to that. In other words, I guess the biggest thing is the free trade right there, right? Because if you send your product over to China and you can make it at dirt cheap prices and then send it right back over into our country, or vice versa if you do it from Mexico and you don't get slapped with a tax at the border. But yet you have to stay here, you have to comply with OSHA, you have to pay workers' benefits, a lot of these different things that we have here and they don't in a sweatshop, country like China, for example. And these are things that Ross Perot brought up about that very problem back in 1992. He was one of the only guy on that debate stage saying, just so you know, this isn't a smart idea here, guys. This is what's going to happen. And sure enough, ironically, the businessman was correct about what was going to happen. He was a business guy himself, and he said, if you do this, jobs are going to leave and they're going to go south. And that's exactly what happened. So, I'm not advocating for a lot of that red tape we see today, because you're absolutely right. That is what has crippled a lot of the middle class. You brought up the minimum wage, for example, there, right? So my take on like the minimum wage is not what you hear from a lot of people, especially those on the left. This whole thing about a $15 an hour minimum wage, one, that is pretty decent. That's above what a lot of jobs pay in my state, where people can make somewhat okay money. Okay. I mean, you wouldn't make close to 15 working at McDonald's, but you would be making close to 15 and probably still not quite 15 working at a Lowe's or Home Depot, something like that. Right. And so that being said, that's the cost of living here. Now, if I take $15 an hour and stick that in New York, I'm not putting a dent in anything. Okay. Right. I'm probably still not able to afford an apartment to live in. So that minimum wage idea, where we're being told that's how we're going to get, a basic wage where we can live. I forget the exact term they use for it, a livable wage or something like that, right? That doesn't apply in all 50 states. And if you get it high enough so that it meets the level needed to live in New York, you're going to cripple people in my backyard, because that's way above what we would need to live on around here. For example, I've got a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house on about a 1/4 acre of land here, right? Fenced in backyard. I'm close to things nearby, and I'm not even paying $100,000 for this house. Try getting that in California, New York, Florida. You're just not going to be able to get things at that prices. So that's a big problem there with that minimum wage argument. I do think I would be afraid to just eliminate the minimum wage altogether, and I would have to see studies on it. I think there's valid arguments. I've heard the libertarian argument, that basically setting that minimum wage, like you pointed out, it was put in place to stop people from getting a job. But I'm certainly not on board with what the left's proposing as the solution here either. In my opinion, if you're going to do anything minimum wage wise, it should be taken state by state. State leaders should be brought in on this. There should be some interaction where they say, oh, okay, what would someone need to be making per hour to be able to survive within your state? And it should be taken as a state by state basis and turn it back over to the states, in my opinion. Let the states do things like that. The federal government has some control on states, mind you. So, for example, how did the drinking age get, up to 21, or seat belts being mandatory? The government can always, the federal can always kind of, lean on the state and say, look, we want people to have a good income. You need to look at this within your state, figure out what's needed, and things of that nature. But that's, to me, if you're going to do it, that's a far more effective way. And I don't hear a single person on the left even discussing an idea like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of eliminating the federal minimum wage, and that would essentially just leave it to the states. I do think, I think in general it doesn't really work, but I agree with you that if there is going to be a minimum wage, the states absolutely should decide, because the economies and cost of living and everything are so different. I wanted to talk about free trade and businesses going overseas. So I agree with you that that's an issue, and I'll admit that completely unfettered free trade is something I'm not completely sold on, because I think there are some issues with that, not just economically, but I think, some countries, if they're doing certain things, I understand not trading with them as a, almost like a form of sanction. I think in extreme situations that might make sense. I do think that also can lead to war, like it did before World War II with Germany. I think cutting trade off to countries by just punishing them, I think that's not a good thing.
Right.
But we need to make it attractive for businesses to stay here in the first place, right? I mean, we can go after all the symptoms. We can throw giant tariffs on everything. We can tax the hell out of them if they want to go overseas. But what we really have to do is make them want to stay here and employ people. So you've already said that you kind of agree that we got way too much red tape.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I think libertarians would agree with that. We want to simplify everything, because the multiple regulations that we have, a lot of them don't even do anything to make people safer. They don't do anything to protect the environment a lot of the time. I really realized this working in the trade I did with safety and the environment, that probably 80% of the laws for both of those things were really just about compliance. They weren't about improving the situation at all, because sometimes a safety rule can actually make the situation you're in more dangerous, or an environmental rule can make what you're doing more harmful on the environment. So I think realistically what libertarians want is to simplify, and if there's going to be a regulation, that it should be there for a good reason, and it should be well outlined what regulation is. So we would all agree you should not dump coal sludge in rivers, right?
Right.
But coal sludge, when you expand the definition of what that means, and then you expand the definition of what a river is, you can literally be dumping dirt in a field, and the EPA will say you're dumping coal sludge in a river. And, that's too far. So we've got to find where this realistic balance point is, that we're actually, these regulations are actually protecting people, protecting the environment. And then, you're dealing with the root cause of why all these companies are leaving in the first place. And if we ended up with like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, you can bet a bunch more companies would want to get out of Dodge as fast as they could. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And this is something that I brought up actually last night. I was on the Friday night Big Talk Little Talk show, and we were talking about the difference between what you have today and when you had unions who kind of were there for the worker to some degree. But again, back in those days, it wasn't necessarily financially incentive to leave and go elsewhere. That's how unions were effective. When you remove that barrier, where it can be much cheaper to leave and go elsewhere, and then you stick a union out there trying to tell a company, hey, we want this, this, and this, they're going to say, oh, do you now? Well, I know some folks in Mexico or China who don't want that. Bye-bye. And they're going to go. They're going to leave. So you're absolutely right. You have to have a system there where they're either going to want to stay, or it's just not a night and day difference financially to stay versus leave. And that's what we've seen, really, in my opinion, torn away over time. The people who know if they got into those markets, they could make stuff dirt cheap and sell it back to us anyway and make more profit because it costs less to make it, and they could sell it for a similar price. They are the people, in a lot of ways, who went to the government to fund those re-election campaigns, to get in tight with the politicians.
Right.
And that's how I think a lot of that got torn away there over time. Something else that I am not with the left on. The left hates the idea of giving a corporation a tax break. Oh, they make too much money, they shouldn't have a tax break, right? In my opinion, that's one of the ways you can negotiate on keeping them here. Okay, now individuals' tax rates, if we're talking about millionaires, billionaires, or whatever, understand that's not the corporation's tax rate. That's their personal tax rate. So when we're talking about the corporations, you could say, okay, if you do this, this, and this, we'll give you this, this, and this in tax breaks to make it worth your while. Okay. So understand the first thing they're going to say is, well, what are you going to do with income? What are you going to do with income? Well, first of all, what are we spending a lot of that tax money income on? Wars. It's finally time we get out of all these wars. We need that money for other things. We should be using it more right here at home. Right. So if we're losing that money because we're trying to encourage companies to stay here and put their jobs here, then understand it's time to stop being the world's police, because this is where our, income should be. We should go back to being a country where we can actually offer the world a product rather than our product we offer the world being our boys and women in uniform. Okay. That's not the product we should offer to the rest of the world as our military, whether you want them or not. That's not what we should have on the option list here. Okay. So that being said, you've got to get these companies to stay. In my opinion, one of the best things that you got to negotiate with are going to be, taxes. And you brought up reforming, getting a lot of that red tape out of the way. So I can actually speak to a personal story on that one. When I was a security guard here in South Carolina, you had to get a SLED license, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Okay. When I first got one, you could hold multiple security jobs if you needed to. Like if you did private security, for example, I could work for a regular security company during the week. But then if I did private security on my days off at another club, I could take that one license, kind of like a CDL license. It's valid for every trucking company, right? I could take that one license and work at however many jobs. The only thing I was responsible for was keeping that license renewed every single year and keeping it up to date. But then about 2 or 3 years ago, all that changed for security guards in the state of South Carolina. Now you have to hold a license for every job you work at. What's the point of that? You're taking the same training class for every single one of them. You're paying the same fee as long as you kept it the same status. If one was armed or unarmed, that's going to make a difference. But if let's just say it's an unarmed guard, right? You're paying the same fee. You're taking the same class. It tells you the same thing on the back as far as what your rights are. And yet you have to pay for each one for each of those jobs. There's only one reason for that. That's the state strangling money out of people for really no good reason, putting extra red tape in the way. There's really no good reason for that at all. It doesn't help anyone.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm a truck driver, so the example I've given a lot lately is in New Hampshire, which is the state I'm originally from. I think next year they're going to require that you go to truck driving school to get your CDL. Why? I didn't go to truck driving school. My brothers both have their CDLs. They didn't go to truck driving school. And that truck driving school costs like $6 to $10 grand. So you have that requirement, which is for giving the state more money. That's the only purpose. And then you're going to have a bunch of progressives come in and say, we need to pay for this education. And I'm here saying, we don't need that education as long as you can pass the test. That's all that should matter. This is what the difference between being progressive and libertarian is that I feel like we sort of have a lot of the same goals, but they want so much regulation, so much education, so much this, that, and the other thing.
Absolutely.
When you really don't need it, and it wastes so many resources, so much time, so much money. If you have a test put forward and you can pass it, then you should be eligible for whatever job you're trying to get. You know what I mean?
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's actually been something that I've brought up multiple times. You hear Elizabeth Warren, you hear Bernie Sanders, and they get out there and they talk about we want free college or student debt forgiveness. Now, because of the flawed system, I guess I could see the point to the debt forgiveness thing to a degree there, because but I would say this too. I don't think that someone who is rich and mama and daddy were paying for them to go to college, whatever, which they might not even have a student loan. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest thing back to my original point there, they're talking about doing this for these colleges where people go to get their liberal arts degree. Where does that come back into being productive into society after the fact? This is taxpayer money that's going to be used to forgive this debt now, right? Or take the debt forgiveness out of it. You're wanting to make it free to go. So now we're paying for these classes. Where is this return of investment going to be for us as a society? Where are the jobs waiting on that? Because I tell you what jobs I see that don't go away. Obviously, things will get, certain things get replaced by automation over time. It's been happening. It's going to continue to happen. But what isn't going to go away are the people who are needed to work on those machines. What isn't going to go away is car mechanics. What isn't going to go away is welders. What isn't going to go away is machine tool, things like that, right? A lot of these trade jobs. And so to me, what I've found is that even in the jobs we've got today, you hear about a lot of, well, we've got jobs and we don't have people trained to do them. Well, why is that? I think, and I've found this even in a red state like mine, starting in high school, they require you to take so many English classes. They require you to take so many math classes. Okay, math you would certainly need. I don't know that you'd necessarily need trig. You know what I mean? Depends on what field you're going into there. Then they require you to take so many science classes where you end up dissecting a frog, things of that nature, right? By this point in high school, they're emphasizing to you about thinking about what you want to do for a career. Okay, what if I've made up my mind I want to pursue law enforcement? Why do I need to learn to dissect a frog? Why do I have to have that science credit? Meanwhile, there was a tech school that partnered up with the high schools, and you could go take classes, but what were those? Electives. And electives were what you were able to take after you had done the classes they required you to take. Whatever you had in your extra time, that's what you could sign up for. But you had to compete with 3 other high schools for that as well, because it wasn't just mine. 2 other nearby high schools also partnered up with that one. So the list to get into those classes, you better be quick and you better be first one at the guidance counselor's office or you weren't getting in because they filled up like that. Well, that right there, you could almost not even have to worry about too much college. If you got certified through one of those schools, you could arguably take us right there 40 to 50 years back in time where people were able to leave high school and go out and get a good paying job. If I learned how to weld when I left high school and had a welding certification, I could go right into somewhere and get hired, start making good money. You wouldn't even have to worry about college at that point. That's much better use of funding. Get us some things that actually work. That when someone takes that class and they come out of it, there's going to be a job out there waiting for them. And they're going to need that job to make money. They're going to need that money so they don't wind up on the government dole receiving handouts month after month because they can't find a job because they sunk thousands of dollars into learning psychology and never became a doctor. That's not productive. There's no return of investment from that.
Yeah, I mean, kind of what you're getting at here is what a lot of libertarians mean to say, but they just don't have the good communication skills. So a lot of libertarians, they attack the guy who's working the minimum wage job and saying, well, it's your fault. You just didn't work hard enough, or, they're attacking people who are on food stamps. And that's completely counterproductive because, first of all, they don't know that person's story, and not all of those stories are the same. But what I attack is what you were just outlining right there, and it's the system that led the people down the path they went down that brought them to where they were. So that's what needs to be dismantled, because you're absolutely right. I graduated high school, 8 years ago, and there was this, this big push that if you're going to be successful, you need to go to a 4-year college, you need to work a white collar job, and if you don't do that, you're not going to make any money, you're going to be miserable, you're going to hate your life. I didn't go to college. I instantly got my CDL working at a lumber yard, and then I went into power line work. By the time I was 25, I was making $100,000 a year.
Yes.
So I was making like probably twice what my guidance counselors who were telling me that you will never be successful if you go into a blue collar job. So I've really tried to convey that to a lot of people who are coming out of high school. You know, don't listen to this failed system that's telling you to get into debt, to get a degree for a job that might not exist and a job that you might not even be good at. You know, at least take a gap year, go out and see the world, just get a job in the field that you think you want to go to college for, see if it fits your head, and then make an educated decision. But that's not what we do. So libertarianism to me is really about attacking root problems, because to me, everyone else goes after symptoms, you know, like gun control, that's going after a symptom.
Yes.
I think tariffs are going after a symptom. I think minimum wage is going after a symptom. You know, all these things are like, we can't, what they even say is like, as a society, we can't allow this to happen. You know, like we can't allow someone to work for less than $10 an hour.
Right.
And I'm saying, well, why don't we work on dismantling the system that has led so many people down this wrong path to a place where they can't get a job and they're in debt. So that's really what the message is to me, you know, and I mean, you just perfectly outlined it with what you were saying there.
Yeah, I agree with you. In my observation, a lot of what I've seen, and some of it comes from Republicans as well, but a lot of these particular issues are, and this is, you know, it's effective. You know, that's what a lot of these people have their focus on, because Democrats and Republicans can give them that little bit of bait and they bite it every time. That's something that I've noticed. For example, with a lot of the protests that we saw recently, you know, how is it that a guy like Joe Biden, who passed the crime bill back in the 90s and the record he has, holds the majority of the African-American vote in this country, right?
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me. And it's because people are not looking at the right thing. You just laid it out. You've got to address the root problem. What is the root problem here? What they're advocating for would be like if you've got a dead tree in your front yard and it's going to fall on your house and you need to cut it down, rather than just getting the whole tree removed. Let me go cut one limb off at a time out here.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, the whole trunk and everything's still standing. It's going to fall sooner or later. It's going to crush your house.
Right.
You're not addressing the problem. And arguably, I think that they've gone on to it to the point that we're at now, especially with COVID and everything else. The tree's starting to fall to a degree here. You know, the economy's going backwards because of the pandemic. As far as what the Democrats and the Republicans did for anyone to pull through it, they just focused on pumping Wall Street up and said the heck with everything else. You know, and one argument that Republicans made for the whole COVID situation, right, that Democrats said would be wonderful, was that extra $600 they did for the unemployment thing, right? Now, the first thing Republicans said was, that's going to incentivize a lot of people to not come back to work. The Democrats said the opposite. No, they needed to get through this, right? Okay, I guess I could see the argument from both sides. But I'll tell you what I noticed at my job. They really had some serious layoffs there for a while. But after they started reopening, people weren't coming back to work. And they thought they were going to be able to continue to draw the unemployment. So they were not returning the calls. They didn't want to come back to work. And then all of a sudden, when their checks cut off, because they could do that, the minute they called you back and you said, no, I'm not coming back, they'd cut you off right there. And you wouldn't get another check. Immediately, you started seeing a lot of them. Oh, wait a minute. Can I come back to work now? So, unfortunately, I do think that there is an issue there with society and America's values to a degree. I don't feel that a lot of people coming up today appreciate hard work. I feel like people and parents need to really stop spoiling their kids and teach them the value of hard work and hard work paying off. That is something that needs to be brought back, because that's something that was taught to me all my life. And that's another big issue with like those tech schools, for example, right? It's going to have a much better return of investment, but you might have to get your hands dirty. You might go home sweaty at the end of the day. You're not going to be sitting in an air-conditioned cubicle, and that's what all these they want, that cushy job, the prop. Understand, though, there's a reason that there's fairy tales and real books about real events out there. You're thinking about utopias. Welcome to the real world. It's not always going to be a situation where it's just the way you want it to be. Sometimes you got to get some skin in the game and do some hard work to reap the benefits. It's not just going to come to you. And I feel like with a lot of our upcoming generation, it's not necessarily their fault, but I don't think that we've done enough schooling and everything to instill these things into the upcoming, generation of tomorrow that, look, you're still going to have to put that into the game. And maybe, tell me what you think on this. I feel like part of what's defeated it is that they've told so many people, without this, you have no chance anyway. I feel like that's really killed a lot of the morale for people to want to try to do something on their own, is because they've said you won't have any chance at it if you go this path. And to me, that's just not true. Now, for example, does, like you pointed out, where you said it's counterproductive for libertarians to attack people and say, no, it was your fault. You didn't pull yourself up by the bootstraps and have, A, B, or C. I agree with you 100%, because as I laid out, that tech school, I wasn't able to get into a lot of those classes that I wanted to get on because there was such a list waiting for people to get into those classes. That's like I said, you had to be one of the quicker ones there. Likewise, you're also dealing with high schoolers at that point, right? I mean, we all know what we were like in high school. Some mature faster than others, but some haven't quite got there yet. So they might not have been that serious to get to the guidance counselor's office before anyone else. And by the time they stumbled around to it, class was already filled up. So that's where you need the expansion into that area. That's what's going to, give you that return of investment, not just paying for the liberal arts degree. So, under the current circumstances, I don't know that I would just be throwing blame around. Understand we've got work to do to fix the problem. And in my opinion, that's part of what's going to be needed to fix it. And understand that people who may have missed that opportunity because of those situations, if you fix that problem, they might be able to turn things around and take it, after the fact, instead of having so many of these just colleges, where they go in there to learn psychology and something else. If you go to a regular college, my mother-in-law's in accounting, right? That's numbers. That's nothing but numbers. You just crunch numbers and add, subtract, multiply, divide all day long. Okay. But when she went through college, she had to take certain other classes that have nothing at all to do. And this isn't high school at this point. Now we're into college. Nothing at all to do with accounting. One of the classes she had to take was on astrology. What does looking at the stars have to do with accounting? Nothing at all. But they make you take it. So again, you're focusing on the wrong thing. If you get more schools out there where people can do things like that, they can get the jobs. They might even be able to finally pull themselves up by the bootstraps and get that good paying job, get the certification, get the training. So that's addressing the problem and actually hitting it at the root. And but what are your thoughts on that? Because that's been something that I've been saying for years, ever since I came out of high school. It's an utterly flawed system.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a couple good points there. And one is that it's a societal problem, not just a systemic problem. And I think a lot of people need to realize that the government is not going to make us a more moral society. That's up to us. No. If we're going to value hard work and honesty and, doing a good job. Those are things that are going to be individual, one at a time. We've just got to start caring about those things again. You cannot legislate that. I think what you can legislate is dismantling that bad system, So I think that the inherent problem with government, and the reason we should use it as little as possible, is that government is a monopoly, right? So there's no competition, there's no reason to cut back, there's no reason to reallocate. It has a fixed income that every employee who works for it knows they're going to get. And so there's no reason to improve, where if you have something that will go out of business if it doesn't meet the needs of the people, it's going to adjust to the times. So that's why our education system is so outdated, because it's a bunch of bureaucrats controlling it. And so when you hear things about like getting rid of the federal Department of Education, people instantly draw that line to meaning get rid of education, don't educate kids anymore. It's like, no, what we mean is we want a system where teachers are allowed to teach kids and use, their skills. We don't want executives and bureaucrats demanding how teachers are supposed to use their resources, giving them all these stupid rubrics, encouraging them to, go through the system that you and I just laid out.
Right.
We want an education system that is going to educate people and adjust to the times. So I think we need to work in that direction, but we also need to work on a societal level, like I just said. And do you know Mike Rowe? Have you ever listened to him?
To who?
Mike Rowe. He did the Dirty Jobs show. I don't know if you.
I haven't actually heard of him. I'll have to look him up. Is he on YouTube?
Yeah, I mean, just look up Mike Rowe. You'll really like what he says. You were kind of just outlining it there. But he outlines this systemic problem we have that we were just talking about. But he's also trying to make work cool again, like make young people think it's cool to go out and work with your hands and get something done and have a product at the end of the day that you can be proud of. And
absolutely,
that's what it's really about. Like we have to make things, unfortunately nowadays, like things have to be flashy and exciting. So we've just got to use that vernacular when we're talking about work. Like this is why my username is the Naturalist Capitalist. I talk about a lot of this type of stuff, and capitalism encourages you to better yourself and society around you. Socialism is about what can society do for me, and that's what's backwards. Like we need to get back to this individualism that we used to have, that you're kind of talking about when you were a kid. And I think you see the lack of individualism killing our society, even with things like the coronavirus. There's no independence anymore. There's this mass hysteria. When something goes down for 2 days, no one knows how to make it anymore. No one trusts each other to be responsible. No one thinks that if someone has coronavirus, they're going to stay in their house. Like no one's taking it upon themselves to be a sane adult. We have to trust the system to take care of us. And then guess what? The system doesn't take care of us and everything goes into chaos.
Yeah, and imagine that. We're going to trust a government to handle a situation where it comes to a virus properly, and yet even our own government has, virus testing sites all over the country, like, the infamous Plum Island. You know what I mean? So that takes things to a whole nother level. Too much reliance on the government. Something that I brought up, since we're talking about, the relying on the government and what a handout actually does, instead of, going out there to earn it in a degree. Me and Dave got to talking about this. Now, this is where subjects can get a little more, can be touchy. But when we look at like what the long-term effects have been with like affirmative action, for example, right? The nuclear family within a lot of the African American community has decreased as a result of a lot of these things. There's not, now you can also say that has a lot to do with like that crime bill, for example, that we made mention of earlier. But at the end of the day, there's less mothers and fathers involved to help raise the kids at this point. The societal problems have contributed to all races. But the big thing on the affirmative action, the goal was, okay, you've been down the totem pole. We're going to put something in place from the federal government that's going to give you a break. But it's completely flawed logic, in my opinion, when you look into it. So the way they structured it was, they said, okay, on a college campus, for example, we want diversity. So we want more people of color involved. So if the white person scores here, we'll accept a black or brown person if they score here. That way we got the diversity going, right? Well, that didn't really help too many people because they were scoring here, and there's probably a reason why the original acceptance score was here, and then they got into college and they couldn't keep up or flunked out and they didn't last. What was the benefit? They didn't come out of this with anything except for potential failure, right? Likewise, if the entire purpose was to help minorities get that chance, you brought up earlier about the minimum wage was to keep Asians and black and brown people from getting jobs, right? Key word in there is Asians, right? Now, maybe I missed something, but I don't hear the Democrat Party talking about the Asian community very much. It's always, I've always heard them focus on either African Americans or Latinos. You don't hear too much about the Asian community. And yet somewhere in the mix of all this, while we're doing something to help minorities out, how is it that on that same scale, a black person could score here, a white person could score here, but an Asian person had to score here now all of a sudden? How in the heck did that happen? That's a minority group that's now being told they have to score even higher than the white person. I thought this was to help the minorities out. It worked completely against itself. And here's the thing that I brought up to David. I said, this, if people examine it, should honestly be a big awakening, and the Democrat Party should not get the African American community's vote anymore. We could debate who else could get it, but it shouldn't be the Democrats. The Democrats are the ones who started Jim Crow. The Democrats started the Dixiecrats. They started, the Ku Klux Klan. Then they had their big change, right? They quit being that old party that did things like that. But did they really? Because they put things like that in place that still told you don't have a chance in any way, shape, or form out there unless you rely on us to take care of you. And they went along with the idea. They voted for them for all of these years. And of course, you've got white liberals who are saying the same thing. Yeah, the Democrat Party looks out for them. Then why has the situation not improved over the last, 30 to 40 years in particular? Their situation isn't any better, and in a lot of ways, it's kind of gone down. I mean, you've got celebrities out there. Sure, there's a lot more people who broke through and became successful. But as far as where the rest of that blue collar, inner city class is at, again, less mothers and fathers for raising the kids, which then in turns, when you don't have mother and father, that can create a lot of issues growing up. If you've only got the one parent, kids can be more likely to end up going down bad paths. And I'm speaking from experience on that one because I had a split family growing up. Now, obviously, I came out of it on the other side from where a lot of people come out on it, and that's for any race. But you increase the chances there. There's a lot of things that are put pressure-wise onto children. That's why it's best to try to keep the family together. So, again, what has the Democrat Party done for any of them? So that shows you right there, this handout mentality and not having to actually work for anything, it has been very counterproductive. Do I think that applies to everything, healthcare and all? No. I don't necessarily agree with a complete government-run healthcare program, but I do think there needs to be steps, to cut back on a lot of that. As we were talking about earlier, crony capitalism with what we pay here, for example. You know what I mean? And I've heard the argument that a lot of that money goes back into research and development. Yet, from what I've studied on that, there's already a lot of taxpayer money being used for that in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's one argument. When I get into the healthcare, the left has my ear to a degree, but I don't like, let's say, the British option, where the government just has complete control over the whole thing. The only way I feel like something like that could be halfway decent is if the politicians who are in charge of running it had to also participate inside the system. Because the one thing we found is when it does not affect them, they will, of course, let it go to the wayside. Look what's happened to Social Security, for example, right? These politicians, they've got their money. They don't draw Social Security, and they've let the whole system go to pot. So they're going to do that with anything else you start government-wise, unless they've got skin in the game as well.
Yeah, so I want to talk about those two issues, because those are also, I think the Libertarian Party has a pretty good answer on. So healthcare, the whole reason we have this cronyism goes back to, I think it was either the late 40s or the early 50s. There were price controls put in place so that you couldn't pay people more than a certain amount, and companies had to be enticing to get employees. So that's where employment-based insurance comes from. That's why it's married to your job. So that's one thing. But then a lot of these regulations that don't let you buy from companies across state lines or join different cooperatives, all these government controls make it so that the insurance companies can make an absolute killing on us. So I think that a lot of people, when they hear that we need a free market option for healthcare, they look at what we have already and they mistakenly think that it is a free market, where it is not. It is rigged to benefit the insurance companies. I don't know if you know much about health insurance cooperatives. Have you ever heard of those before?
I've heard of the term. My main knowledge when we get into the healthcare system, like I said, I've heard it. Don't exactly know the right offhand definition, but my main knowledge when we get into healthcare is you've got the private market, and then you've got obviously public healthcare. I've studied a little bit on what each one does, but touch on what you were talking about with that co-op for a moment.
Yeah. So this, in my mind, it's not perfect in the system we have now, but it's the best thing we could have going forward. It's basically Medicare for all without the government. So it's like it's like a credit union. A bank has a private owner, where a credit union is investor owned. Everyone who has money in the credit union owns it. So it's the same idea with a cooperative. There's a pool from everybody who gives to the health insurance cooperative. And my aunt and uncle are in one. Right now, because of regulations and things, they're very specific for you to be able to get into one. Like you have to be there's a farmer cooperative or a Christian cooperative, whatever.
Right.
But my aunt and uncle, they have really good health insurance. They pay like $100 a month between the two of them. Because the way it works is, depending on your, what health, depending on what your situation is when you join, you only have to pay for whatever plan you want. And then if there's a medical emergency that you have, there's no middleman through the insurance through some private insurance company. The pool just automatically pays your bill for you. You pay directly to the hospital, and the pool from everyone in the insurance collects toward whatever happened. So you have, obviously these things are better when there's more people involved, because then when you have more money in the pool, more things are covered. But the system we have right now is a one-size-fits-all approach, that someone who is extremely healthy needs the same plan as someone who's, 65 years old and has asthma. So there's so much waste where you could have a system like that. And as I said, it's not perfect right now, but I think moving forward, that could be a system that gets us out of government involvement with healthcare, but also has an investor-owned deal, so we're not at the mercy of, big insurance companies and their private owners. It's something that we all own collectively, that we don't have to worry about bureaucrats messing with. I think that makes the most sense moving forward, something like that. And then with Social Security, I kind of like what Jo Jorgensen says. I don't know if you know who Jacob Hornberger was. He was the guy who looked like he was going to win. And I'm glad he didn't win, because his thing is like libertarianism tomorrow. We're just going to pull the plug on everything and everyone's going to have to deal with it. And I was like, dude, you can't run on that. Like, people who pay into Social Security have been forced to do it their whole lives. There was no choice of their own. And so that's their money. You can't just tell them like, nope, done. So I like her idea. What we need to do is, I do think it's what's the word I'm looking for? I don't think it's a system that will continue to work forever. I think it's something that has to end. But what we should do is allow young people to opt out of it, and then the government should sell entities. I'd say lots of, like aircraft carriers and whatever that we don't need, and pay the people who have put all this money into Social Security, reimburse them, and then move away from it in that direction. I don't think the idea that we can just say, hey, sorry, it's gone. But that is what's going to happen if we just keep going down this road without doing anything. People my age, I'll pay into it for however long, and then when I'm whatever the retirement age is, it's going to be gone. So we have to do something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And again, this shows what the government will do. And this has been my biggest concern with the talk of Tulsi's, or a single payer plus, or Bernie's Medicare for all. What you laid out with the co-op is basically what I've been saying that we should really have there. We need something where when you go in, paying into it would be just like paying for your taxes, and you don't have the copay, you don't have all these other things. When you go, you get what you need done, and you come out, the bill's paid for. You've been paying into it so that when you needed that, it was there. My biggest concern is I don't trust the government with that many things. So, I don't trust them to regulate my Second Amendment. Okay, I don't like them telling me what I can and cannot say. They've shown us they'll walk all over our Fourth Amendment with the Patriot Act, and just like with Social Security, Lyndon Johnson set the precedent for what depleted Social Security when he tapped into the funding to fund what? War. So he could send us into Vietnam. Okay. And of course, that's what they did ever since, was they just wrote IOUs and stuck them back in, and the money has not been replenished. What you literally have is like a Ponzi scheme. People like me and you who don't draw Social Security pay taxes into a system to fund those who are drawing the Social Security, because their money was taken out by the government who was left in charge to run this thing. And if that's the way they're going to run our healthcare system, it's going to be disastrous. For example, I hated Obamacare because I could not afford it. And even if I could afford the monthly premium, okay, because I didn't qualify for the subsidized premium, right? Even if I could have afforded month to month, I could never have used this stuff. The deductible was going to be that high. So I went for quite a few years there, when I didn't get health insurance, just getting penalized every single year, and wasn't going to the doctor, mind you, either. This is something that I've told other people. I had an issue about a year or two ago where I was trying to open a box, wasn't doing it the smartest way. Wound up stabbing myself in the hand with scissors and treated it at home with peroxide, Loctite, gauze, and an ACE bandage. Okay. I wasn't going to the doctor. to get stitches because not exactly in my budget at the moment, and I don't have the insurance. So that really did nothing but hurt a guy like myself. And then I hear Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden come out, and their plan is buying into Medicare, right? And so if you want it, you can have it. If you don't, you can still get a private plan. That is one of the craziest things that I've ever heard. And the reason why is because you need that pool of everyone. Like you said, you've got to have the pool where everyone's putting something in. The reason why is because a lot of blue collar folks tend to maybe not eat the 5-star cuisine every night, right? We get high blood pressure as we get older because our way of living takes a toll on our health. We eat Burger King, we eat McDonald's, we eat Wendy's, we eat all this fast food. It takes a toll on our bodies over time. Okay. Whereas people who are more wealthy, more affluent, might not eat so much greasy stuff all the time, right? They're hitting the gym more often. They can take their yoga and Pilates class. They do all these things. It doesn't affect their health. They're going to be less likely for cholesterol, less likely for heart attack, less likely for stroke. And so if all you've got are the poorer, sicker people paying taxes into the government program, because remember, if you didn't use the government program under the Biden-Buttigieg plan, you also didn't pay taxes into it either, right? That was the difference between theirs and Tulsi's. Tulsi said everybody's paying taxes whether you use it or not. Theirs said, no, you're only going to pay taxes if you use it. So the people who are going to want the government plan as opposed to the private plan they've already got are the people who are lower middle class, blue collar folks and need the health care because it's too, expensive under the current system right now and they can't afford it. And so if they're the only ones paying in, they're also going to be probably the most likely to have to use it for all these things later on down the line. And I don't know that the numbers are going to balance themselves. There's probably going to be a deficit in the funding because they don't make that much. So they're not going to be putting as much into the pool, but they're going to have to get all of it out as they get old later on to fund that insulin every month or the diabetic treatment or whatever they have to go in there for when they have a heart attack, right? All these things are going to come into play. There's going to be a balance in the system. The numbers aren't going to match each other. And that government program is going to fall flat on its face. And you'll be right back to square one, and it'd probably be taken out anyway. So I'm sitting there looking at it, I'm like, this is nothing but crazy. How anyone, and I don't know, from what I gathered, I don't think you're in favor of that system either. But
hell no. Yeah.
I'm waiting because there's people who thought that was the greatest idea, and I'm like, please give me a rational argument to this because this makes zero sense to me.
Right. I mean, I think a big misconception about libertarians is we are all for voluntary socialism. So if you want to be part of a company that is worker owned, or if you want to be in a cooperative, whether it's insurance or whatever it is, that is 100% cool. We are all about that. What we're not about is, and I voted for Tulsi Gabbard, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. I was one of her supporters. We can talk about that later. But her plan, sounded okay. It sounds good, except for the fact that the federal government, the same federal government that she was telling us is doing all these terrible things, has misallocated all our money, has, lied to us. It's just done all this shit. You want that to run this system. No, thank you. So that was part of her platform I was never on board with. But I guess we'll start wrapping it up here because we've been talking a while. But I want to thank you for coming on, man. I'll definitely have you back on. This channel after the election's over is actually going to kind of phase away from politics and talk a lot more about a lot of the things we were talking about personal responsibility, being proud of working hard, and making a better life for yourself, making good decisions. So I'd love to have you back on again and talk about more of those things. But I'll just give you the last word. If you want people to follow your show or follow you on social media or anything, just tell us what we can do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You can find me over on Twitter. Twitter handle is at VigilantIndep1, INDEPE1. Over on YouTube, no longer the Independent Report. If some of you recognize me and wonder where I disappeared to, went through a rebranding process. The YouTube channel is the Lone Wolf Podcast. Blue collar take on things, shoot straight, tell it like I see it. And, it's been a pleasure coming on. I'll look forward to coming back on with you later, man.
All right, we'll see you next time. And thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll catch you on the next episode.